So today I'm here to talk about the science fiction fantasy I've been reading recently, and it is only March as I record this, and I have possibly already found my favorite fantasy book of the entire year. So I'm really excited to share that with you, along with a lot of other new releases, some fantastic, some not so much, and a few in between. So all that being said, let's get started. First, before we get into fantasy, let's talk science fiction because in my opinion, the genre does not get enough attention on BookTube. And so I want to start with a book called Past Crimes by Jason Pinter. This is a new release, a science fiction thriller that is set in a near future where virtual reality has become very much more popular, as we've seen a lot of near future stories. And particularly in this one, it takes the idea of what will happen in the true crime genre because of that. So the idea here is that if someone commits a crime, they no longer have the intellectual property of their own story, and so that becomes public property, in which case, as long as the victims will sign off on it, the events happening around true crime can be turned into virtual reality. So we follow someone whose job it is to go to these victims' families and tell them that they want to turn their stories, their pain, into these hollow novels that people can experience online. And so we follow this as they're doing their job, and of course there's more going on in the story. So something happens with this woman's husband, and she gets pulled into a darker story. So this one I love because it really deals a lot with the fact that, the question, I suppose, of whether or not we actually have control over our stories. Is it ours to tell? Is it our property to give away? Or really, what rights does someone have after they commit crimes? And so there's really good, interesting social conversations happening within this book, which in my mind was some of the strongest aspects to the story. Beyond that, it's just a really entertaining, thrilling narrative that moves very quickly. You don't quite know who to trust. And as someone who loves a lot of true crime, I do love, again, the conversations around our obsession with it. I am someone who is very fascinated by the subject matter of true crime, but I also have to try to weigh it with my own morals and really question myself why I get entertainment from something like this. And the book plays into that. It's smart, it's interesting, it's fun. I don't know quite where it's going to land in terms of my favorites of the year, but it definitely is an early contender. It's an interesting book. When it comes to sci-fi, that's always what I'm looking for. Next, let's talk about Floating Hotel by Grace Curtis. This is another new release science fiction book. In this one, it's set in this hotel that is this moving spaceship. It is a luxury liner where it has the best food, the best accommodations, and rather than people going to the hotel moves from planet to planet, and so that is how it picks up guests. We follow the story particularly from the perspective of someone who lives there as a caretaker, and the story, while it is technically a novel, in a way reads a little bit more like vignettes where we follow different characters, and the idea here is that everyone has their secrets, there is more going on, and we follow the story from this outside perspective of the caretaker who is very much immersed in the world of the ship. It is their home, but they are really this outside perspective on what the guests are up to. And so it's a very character-driven, slow-burning story that has light coziness of something like the Wayfarer series. If you love a story that's set in space, but it's much more about the people than the technology, this one might appeal to you. I liked it. It didn't quite knock it out of the park, perhaps because I didn't find the characters as interesting as I would have liked. I love the premise that everyone has a secret, everyone's hiding something, but the premise of the book, or the marketing around it, promises a more juicy story than you'll get. Instead, it's a little bit more light and thoughtful and quiet in a way that didn't entirely hook me in, but I still like this one. I think it's doing some really interesting things. I would definitely read more by this author, and I can absolutely see an audience for this because I know there's a lot of people looking for almost a bit of a slice of life science fiction story. So it's not the end of the world, it's not a pandemic, an apocalypse, etc., but instead a little bit more close to home, even when you're floating in the stars. Next, let's talk about Denial by Jon Raymond. Now, this is technically a backlist title, but I believe it's only a few years old, and I completely missed it the year it came out, so I'm glad I finally got to it. This is a climate fiction story, or cli-fi for those of you that don't hate that descriptor. And in the story, it's set in a very much near future where climate change has had its effects on our environment. And so basically, we're seeing the short-term effects that are predicted to come to life, and the societal adjustments that come with it. And within the story, we follow a journalist journalist. In this world, there are those that have gone into hiding. They are set to come to trial because they are those that are seen as being responsible for a lot of the corporate greed that led to the environmental catastrophes that happen. And so this one journalist gets a tip about this person who's gone to hiding under a different name. And so he goes off to track him down. What's unexpected, and this is all in the back of the book, is that he ends up actually having a connection with this person. And he turns out to not be the blackened villain that he appears to be, or at least he's a more nuanced character. And so the journalist has to decide whether or not to take him in or actually protect this individual. I love this story on so many levels. This was one of the best early books I've read this year in terms of science fiction, so I do recommend it. In my mind, it's completely underhyped because, like I said, I completely missed it when it was a new release. So first, I really love the world building of this one because, as I mentioned, it's set in a very close future, so we do see the environmental effects and the way the society is shifted because of that, but it's not a far-flung future. It's not something like Orcs and Crake where you see the end of the world. Instead, we see a world where we have really been pushed to move into things like public transit and things like that in a more serious way because, again, it's not our generation, but perhaps the generation after us that have to make all these adjustments. They had to deal with the fact that their parents and grandparents didn't make those choices first to make their life easier, and they have to make so many more changes to try to deal with that. So obviously this book deals a lot with environmentalism, which always gets strange comments down below. I'm not looking to argue it per se today, but from my perspective as someone who is very interested in environmentalism and considering my own carbon footprint and things like that, I thought this book was really smart. And then what I like what the story does, again, to me, it didn't feel preachy. It deals with a lot of topics that are hot button for other people. They aren't for me. I just like the subject matter. I think it's great to talk about. Is the fact that, again, this journalist ends up being very conflicted when he's presented with this man who is supposed to be this environmental villain. And he's just not quite as villainous as he would expect to be. He's actually a real life person who has nice qualities. And again, I love a story that shows someone being morally gray as opposed to a story where it's so easy to just paint someone as the bad guy, but a story that actually shows this darker future and still shows the fact that people can make bad choices that are not good for our earth and still not inherently be trying to do evil actions. And I just think it's, again, just smart. It's the kind of book that makes me think, which I love, and I really hope that more people check it out, especially if it's a topic you're interested in. I've discussed that I want to do a whole climate fiction video, and this will definitely be on there because it was so good and I would love to see more people reading it. Now let's switch over to fantasy and let's talk about that book that is easily the contender for the favorite book of the year when it comes to fantasy. And that, of course, is The Trials of Empire by Richard Swan. This is the third and final book in the trilogy that starts with The Just of Kings. 2 years ago, that was my favorite book, and then the sequel, Tyranny of Faith, was my favorite book for fantasy last year. And so this book is headed in the same direction. Without giving away any spoilers, this is set in a world where we follow a man named the Justice of the Land. So we follow him, who is this man who has the ability to investigate these crimes and also lay down the law on behalf of the ruling body. But specifically, what people often miss when they pick up this book is that it's not told from his perspective, but rather from Helena, who is a scribe and follows him through his adventures. And she is a young woman who very much comes to age and grows into herself throughout these books. And so if you're going to read these books, there is this really cool character of Von Bolt. He is just this manly man, this really enticing, mysterious individual. And instead we get the story from the perspective of this young woman who is very much uncertain of herself. She admires Von Bolt, which is very much a part of the story, is there is this unrequited attraction on her part that starts right in the first book. So again, it's not a spoiler here, that she is very much interested in him because he is this male figure in her life, and you follow that. Some people do not love or appreciate those aspects as much as I did. I love the setup of it. I found it very juicy, very interesting. I loved all of that. And then within the story, you have the actual justice part. Without giving away too much, there are some supernatural elements to the story that lean into perhaps some horrorish elements where they're investigating and using certain techniques to draw information from the dead. And within this last book, it is building. There has been plotting going on throughout the other stories that is leading to this climax, and I thought it was just solid. So often I can be so hard on finales in books, but this one just, for me, it landed the ending. I enjoyed it very much. I did think it was somewhat predictable. If you read the stories that come before and think about it, you're going to have some clues as to where the story is going, who's going to be safe, who is perhaps not, and making those guesses along the way. But specifically, I just enjoyed the story because it is some of the best character work I've ever seen in fantasy. I am completely in love with these characters. I just want to spend time with them. The world itself is interesting. It's not quite as vast in scope, or it doesn't feel as vast as some of these other epic fantasies. Instead, this one is again a much more intimate story, but as the story builds to this third one, the stakes are much larger, and you do see that there is again some exciting climaxes and then some great epilogues and finales and conclusions, and enough left open that it doesn't feel too tightly tied up in a bow. It was just exactly what I wanted, exactly what I was expecting and hoping for in the best possible way. Really enjoyed this one, and again, it's going to take a special book to knock it off of my favorite fantasy published in 2024. It still could happen. Again, it's very early in the year, but I'm going to say that if this one ends up on top at number 1 come December, I won't be surprised because I'm completely in love with this author's work and I can't wait to see what they do next. Next, let's talk about The Slain Divine by David Dalglish. This is the third and final book in another trilogy that started with The Bladed Faith. And this is a series that follows a young man who, at the beginning of the story, right in the first book, he sees his parents, the king and queen, be killed in this plot. And he, of course, goes off to seek revenge. He goes off with these misfits and wants to regain his title and go and kind of seek to get justice for what was done to his family. So a very classic setup to a story. And this, again, is the third book, so a lot has happened, and I will admit that the author did a decent job of moving away from the classic tropes. Like, the book is not exactly what you would expect in terms of this one. I can't really talk too much about the plot, but there's a lot more complexity. They could have gone for a really easy, straight up revenge plot and lacked all the nuance of something like that. Instead, this really grows into a larger, bigger picture that actually has a different focus to it. I like this book, but you can kind of see after the last book I just talked about, this book was good, but it's always hard when you're comparing books to other things, which perhaps is not fair. So I found the story to be overall good. The characters were good. The world building were good. There isn't a lot I would specifically criticize about this book, other than the fact that I think, despite trying to be a little bit more complex and smart of how it does the plot, at the end of the day, I just don't think it was the most interesting story or ending to the narrative. Other people might disagree, which is why reviews are important to have from different people. But for me, I like the beginning of the story a lot more than I like the end. I just found that it kind of didn't do anything that really excited me, and it didn't have a single element like an amazing world building system or magic system or characters or something that really gave it that aha feeling that I got with other books I was reading this year. So I like this book, but you can tell I'm underwhelmed. Next, let's talk about In the Shadows of Their Dying by Michael R. Fletcher and Anna Smith Spark. This is an arc, so it has a different title showing here. But this is a grimdark fantasy. I believe it's the first time I've read both of these authors, and definitely won't be the last. It's a story that follows this third best assassin who teams up with a second-rate mercenary crew to do a job. I think in terms of the premise, I just love it. It's great. You have a little bit of humor that I think is the perfect way to match the tone of a grimdark story, or at least offset it so that you have this bleak world, but there is almost this piece of humor that makes the book more palatable, which I think works for me. Don't get me wrong, it's still very much grimdark. It leans into the tropes and style and what you would expect from a world like this, but it does in a way that, again, I found entertaining and not so depressing. I just wanted to put down the book, and I overall really enjoyed it. For me, what worked the best is the fact that it has a really distinct, strong narrative voice to it. So right from the start, I encourage you just to read the first chapter, and the way it is told immediately pulls you in. It's just very clear that the authors are giving their characters a voice, and you get to see that immediately within the story. In terms of the book, I don't think it's doing anything new or unique I haven't seen, especially with grimdark fantasy. Again, it's kind of a subgenre that has a very specific style, kind of has similar plots that to me aren't incredibly unique or something, again, that's out of the box, but I think that most people picking up the story will be looking for grimdark and they will get what they're looking for. So I actually really enjoyed it. I did give it 4 stars and would, as I mentioned, would definitely pick up more by both authors because I just like the style of it. I don't read as much grimdark as I think I would given my taste in dark fiction, but I might have to change that. So if you have recommendations for other grimdark, either by these authors or someone else, let me know down below in the comments. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And as I mentioned, I may have already found my best fantasy published in 2024, but as you can tell from this video, I haven't found the same for science fiction yet. I found a couple good new releases, but I'm really looking for that home run. So if you know about either a science fiction book that's already being published or is coming out soon in 2024, please drop a note down below so I can check it out. I can request it from my library, purchase a copy, or request from the publisher, all of that. Because for whatever reason, it's so much easier to find favorite fantasy, I think because there's more published every year. But when it comes to science fiction, while I love the genre, I feel like I'm picking favorites from a smaller pool of books, if that makes sense. So if you have a favorite new release or something coming out that you think I'm gonna love, let me know, drop a comment, and we'll talk more down below. So if you're new here, I hope you stick around and subscribe. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and other dark things. If you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a big thumbs up. You can drop an emoji in the comments, something like a spaceship. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.